All,
Our first day of spring was actually March 20th.
Yes, so we are officially in spring now, and it's starting to feel a little bit like spring here in New York City, which is nice. So I'm going to today continue to speak primarily about Ukraine, but I'm going to start trying to do something that is a little broader, and in two respects. The first thing, if you remember back a little bit more than a month ago, we were talking about a series of lectures on what I had called Deranged Democracy. And I don't know if you can see over my left shoulder. Let me turn the camera a little bit. But there's an image there. I keep certain images in my office to remind me and people watching me of some of the things that I think are kind of in the background of thinking about democracy. And on top of my bookcase with all those papers piled on top of it, there's a picture of a drawing by Kata Kollwitz. And it's an image of a woman sheltering her children, presumably, I think we know now, during war. And it's an image I keep there in part because of the idea that democracies are less likely to either oppress their own people or go to war with other societies. So that if you want, if you will, the Churchillian formulation that democracy is the worst form of government except all the others, that democracy tends to be less likely to brutalize either its own citizens or the citizens of other states. I don't want to whitewash democracy and the various campaigns of brutalization that this country, the United States, has been engaged in since its founding, whether it's African Americans, Native Americans, women, our neighbors, especially to the South. We are not certainly lacking in historical guilt, even if we're not very good at historical memory or historical accounting. But having said that, when we look at what Vladimir Putin is doing to the Ukraine and also doing to Russia, I think we begin to see, right, some of the comparative advantages of democracy as well. And so I want to reframe the lecture series and return to some of the themes intermittently over the next few weeks as being about diminished democracy and deranged autocracy. And today, I'm going to speak primarily to you about the Ukraine, and you may have noticed the conflicting signals coming out of Russia right now. On the one hand, an announcement from the Russian military yesterday that they were concluding their operations on a broad front. We'll look at this in a few minutes, but they have a nearly 1,000-mile long front that is logistically unsustainable in the eastern Ukraine, and that they were going to really focus on the Donbass region, where there are a couple breakaway republics, where there's a direct border with Russia, where there's a higher concentration of ethnic Russians who may be sympathetic to Russian annexation of their territory or being ruled by Russian puppet regimes. And that appeared to be, in a sense, perhaps a way out of this war, right? In the sense that the Russian military, one of the advantages of being in an authoritarian state is it can declare victory despite the fact that on the ground, it is clear that its losses are mounting. If the people just watching the TV just listen to what the TV tells them, they may be under the impression that the Russian military was not at war, but in fact was merely supporting a Ukrainian uprising against Ukrainian repression, and that the Russian military has now succeeded in supporting that campaign and successfully diminishing the capacity of the Ukrainian state to repress its own citizens. It's all disinformation and propaganda, obviously, but if it works well enough to allow Putin and the military to save face and get out of the corner they've painted themselves into, in a sense, we should all be thankful. And yet, this morning, as Joe Biden was speaking in Poland, Russian missile strikes were occurring in the far west of Ukraine, in the large western city of Lviv, which has been mainly spared aggression up until this point. And so I'm not quite sure what's happening with the Russian campaign right now. And I think it's important to be transparent about the fact that there may be conflict within the regime, there may be indecision or cross currents, and that some in the military may be looking for a way out, others may be looking to escalate. And so that is where we'll focus today. I start with a montage of images, particularly an image of an elderly woman living, right? She's moved her essential belongings into a subway car in Kiev in order to be out of harm's way. And we are now more than a month into this brutalizing aggression, and we know more about its victims. Mass graves are beginning to be exposed. And one of the things we're learning is that the primary victims of the actual Russian violence, the people who are dying, other than soldiers or those who are engaged in combat, are the immobile. They're the people who can't move over land tens or hundreds of miles. They're the elderly, they're the infirm, they're pregnant women, they're small children. And that this image then helps us to bear in mind the almost unfathomable human cost of this kind of war in the 21st century. Having said that, I have three other images up here as well, and they're all images of Russian losses. And so in a sense, I think that the right juxtaposition here is the humanitarian suffering of the Ukrainians and the military setbacks of the Russians. So we have a troop transporter demolished here, multiple helicopters in flames here. And I would just point out to you that this represents tens of millions of dollars worth of high-tech equipment going up in flames. And here we apparently have a Russian military resupply ship going up in flames and sinking. And so one of the big stories of this has to do with the fact of this asymmetrical warfare in which the Ukrainians are much more successful than anybody anticipated they would be at striking back. And it appears some counteroffensives are now being launched. And on the other hand, the suffering of the Ukrainian people continues to mount. This is now the largest humanitarian crisis in the post-war period. And the Russian strategy does appear to be, I shouldn't qualify it that way, clearly is to inflict maximal humanitarian suffering in order to produce submission from the Ukrainians. So that's where I want to go today. But I know myself, if I start there, that's all we'll talk about. So I'm going to spend a moment. By the way, I guess I should do this. I'm reintegrating the discussion of the Ukraine and other aspects of politics into a broader framework, the framework we had been talking about a month ago, in which we've been surveying the genesis of modern democratic ideas in Enlightenment philosophy and revolutions, and the assumptions about human nature contained, I'm sorry if this sounds a little schizophrenic, in those ideas. And I now want to, in particular, go back to the counter-Enlightenment, and this is where we left off, and to suggest to you that the kind of strategy being employed by Putin, the kind of politics that Putin represents, is clearly in line with the counter-Enlightenment, the anti-democratic strand of the counter-Enlightenment that was inspired as a reaction against Enlightenment ideas. And so this is just situating things a little bit in that outline. Before doing any of that, I do want to look for a moment at some of the other news of the week, or really only one story, and that is about the fact that Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson was in front of the Senate earlier this week in her confirmation hearings. And I just want to focus for a moment on the idea that if confirmed, and it certainly appears that she will be confirmed, you may have seen that Joe Manchin announced that he supports her. He will vote to confirm her. And so it certainly appears that the Democrats have the votes to get her on the Supreme Court. She will be the first African-American woman on the Supreme Court. And I think that in and of itself, that is groundbreaking. And it is certainly the case that a person with her experience, having been a public defender, having the much broader legal experience and a different, obviously personal experience than anybody else in the court, may ultimately change the court. And certainly it also represents a important transition that is occurring in American society as we become more diverse, as we become slowly more reconciled to gender equality. It is past due, long past due, that someone like Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson should be on the Supreme Court. Having said that, I think it's worthwhile noting, right, that she is not going to change the composition of the Supreme Court in terms of voting blocks. If anything, right, and there are different ways of measuring her ideologically, she may actually be less liberal than the justice she is appointing. But much more importantly, she joins a three-member liberal bloc who does not have on their own any power to change the decisions that the Supreme Court makes. And so I just want to immediately note that although we're fixated by this, it is not likely to change the outcomes. But now the outcome of Supreme Court decision making. Let me focus for a minute on the spectacle of her confirmation hearings. And I imagine most of us watched at least aspects of this. And I am dismayed. It seems to me that, you know, for a long time, our appointment or our confirmation hearings of Supreme Court justices have been highly politicized. That's not in and of itself objectionable. As a matter of fact, obviously the Constitution assigns the confirmation, the responsibility to advise and ultimately consent to the president's appointment or withhold consent to a political branch. And the Supreme Court itself is obviously doing political work. You can't interpret the Constitution or the law without taking a political stance. But having said that, it seems to me that the way in which our constitutional framework works, the Supreme Court is supposed to be, in Ronald Dworkin's famous phrase, a forum of principle, a more elevated, a less partisan institution. And the Senate is supposed to be the more deliberative and mature body in our legislature, hence why it was assigned the advise and consent role. And what one would hope for is a sustained scrutiny of the judicial temperament and constitutional views of the candidate, as well as perhaps a heated debate over issues of constitutional interpretation. And that is clearly not what we saw over the last few days. And I'm going to suggest that essentially what we saw was an effort to seed moral panic on the part of a handful, at least, of Republican senators who recognized they probably had no capacity to actually derail the nomination, and so chose instead to grandstand for television news, for Fox News in particular, and for the right-wing social media ecosystem. And I'm using a term here you may or may not be familiar with: moral panic, right? The idea that something is occurring in our midst that is dangerous and scandalous and undetected, and if uncontained, would undo our values and ultimately threaten our way of life. And I want to suggest that increasingly in the post-Trump era, the Republican Party is dominated by moral panic political entrepreneurs, by people who are trying to inspire their followers to think that the sky is falling, the fabric is sundered, that the center doesn't hold, and that we need to be up in arms to resist the profound decay, the debauchery, the degradation of our society. And so this is a product of political polarization, of the populism that has taken hold of the Republican Party, and of themes that I'm not going back to my diagrams about the fact that the Republican Party basically only attracts white voters in a country that is becoming majority non-white, but that the only way the Republican Party continues to hold power is because our constitutional framework amplifies the power of a minority through the Senate, through the equal representation of very small and very large states within the Senate, through the Senate's power then in the Electoral College to potentially elect a president who does not win the majority vote, through the president's ability to then appoint Supreme Court justices, and the Senate's ability to then confirm those appointments, right? And so institutions that are the sensitive to minority power, that amplify minority power, are also populating the Supreme Court. And the majority of members of the Supreme Court right now have been confirmed by presidents who lost the popular vote, and also appointed by presidents who lost the popular vote, confirmed by a Senate where the majority of the senators represent about a quarter of the population. And so with that background, I want to try to make sense of the focus on sentencing of pedophiles, or on the curriculum of Georgetown Day School and the teaching of, again, the book on anti-racist babies, the focus more generally on crime, and that this moment we are in right now, in which we are rapidly changing both socially and culturally and economically, in which a new media environment allows for this tremendous transmission of ideas, a kind of unregulated anarchy in our information system, is making our politics fertile soil for moral panic, for a sense that we are in deep danger of losing our traditions. And I have, this time I will repeat some of my diagrams, shown you on multiple occasions before, my visual representation of Durkheim's ideas, Emile Durkheim's ideas from Suicide, about the work that a society does in creating social roles and norms that allow people to feel like there's sufficient social stability, that they know where they stand, what is expected of them, what is allowed and what isn't allowed. And that in a sense, the process of modernity has been a contraction of the shared roles and norms, that this has been accelerated over perhaps the last 50 years with the new social movements of the 1960s, the civil rights movement, the feminist movement, and the diversification of America, the transformation of our economy, further amplifies the sense that the world we live in is changing very rapidly under our feet. And then the idea that in a climate in which there is a sense on the part of some people of normative threat, of moral panic, of the idea that the center doesn't hold, that things that are taken for granted and have stabilized life just are being very rapidly transformed or dissolved, that in that environment, many people will be attracted to a leader, not because they lower their taxes or increase support for the poor, but because they promise to stop this change, or at least to slow it down, to return things to where they used to be. And that what we're seeing in the confirmation hearing for Ketanji Brown Jackson is a sense of, boy, if you let a Black woman on the Supreme Court, what else can happen, right? And they're not willing to put it that explicitly, right? But they do want to talk about her being soft on pedophiles, soft on crime, attracted to critical race theory. And all of this, I think, is to suggest that this is just the latest indication that we should be panicked. If we are white, straight, and traditional, we are in a world that is increasingly hostile to us, that is increasingly endangering us, and that we need to resist. And be clear about this. They can't keep her off the court, I don't think, but what they can do is whip up their base to vote for them in the coming elections, because this is what happens when Democrats have control of the presidency and have control of the Senate. And I want to be as clear as possible. I think this is degrading of the Senate. I think this is pure spectacle. I don't think there was anything serious in so much of what the Republicans had to say in this hearing. If there's anything that can be said for it, I guess it's revenge taking for what Brett Kavanaugh went through, or going back even further, what Clarence Thomas went through. But having said that, again, I do think that this is rooted in this idea that white men have a certain authority, have a certain status, have a certain standing in our society that in a sense exempts them from scrutiny about their juvenile misconduct, even if that juvenile misconduct perhaps takes the form of sexual aggression or rape, right? That is not supposed to be talked about. Now, if it was talked about when Kavanaugh was nominated, we're going to exact our revenge, even if we can't derail the nomination of the current Democratic president. I do think this poses a danger to the Senate, the Supreme Court, the Constitution, and American democracy. The danger in the first instance is viewing the Supreme Court as a purely political and partisan institution in an era of heightened partisan polarization, which diminishes its standing, its legitimacy. And I hope to, at some point in the not too distant future, do a little lecture series with you on constitutionalism in the Supreme Court. I'm not sure that the Supreme Court actually serves our democracy very well anymore. And so part of the purpose of that lecture series will be to explore these ideas. But having said that, it is what we have to maintain our constitutional framework. And please note that the federal judiciary was a bulwark against the efforts to expand and abuse executive power under President Donald Trump, and that we should be grateful for that bulwark. If we delegitimize that bulwark, if it comes to be seen as nothing more than another partisan institution, it's going to be harder and harder for it to do that work. And so we should be worried that this ultimately could endanger American democracy, especially in an era in which there are strong populist tides at work in our politics that have very little patience for the niceties of constitutionalism and checks and balances. And so it does worry me that there are forces afoot in our politics and our society that tend to erode our already diminished democracy, and that could therefore promote some form of more autocratic government in our society. And each time we tarnish one of our core institutions, and to be clear, I think the Senate has tarnished itself. I think it's primarily a single party, the Republicans within the Senate, that using what should be solemn hearings to instead engage in stupid innuendo and stunts for social media and Fox News diminishes the respect for the institution as a whole, as well as diminishing the legitimacy of the Supreme Court, and that ultimately we may all come to regret that, not only for what it makes someone like hopefully Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson go through, but also for what it does to our democracy. Now, I will say one more thing here, and I just want to briefly note, because this is, I think, in a sense, being eclipsed by what's happening in our politics. There are very important decisions in front of the Supreme Court right now, including on abortion, including on gun rights, including on campaign financing, but also, and I want to really highlight this case that was argued a little bit more than a month ago, West Virginia versus the EPA, in which West Virginia challenged the Environmental Protection Agency's ability to regulate under the Clean Air Act coal-fired electrical plants emissions. And they challenged it in advance of any standards actually having been imposed by the EPA. And it did appear that a majority of the conservative justices on the court would side with West Virginia. And if that happens, it will paralyze the capacity of the Biden administration and future presidential administrations to do anything meaningful about climate change in the sector that is one of the largest contributors, the energy generation sector. And in addition to that, the argument that is being made is that because the Clean Air Act, in a sense, takes for granted the existence of the EPA and its capacity to regulate this, it doesn't specifically authorize a specific kind of regulation from the EPA. Therefore, the EPA doesn't have the power. And if that line of thinking is upheld by the Supreme Court, it's not only hostile to our capacity to avert global climate crisis. And you may know that Justice Jackson famously said that the Constitution is not a suicide pact. This would effectively make this Constitution a climate suicide pact. But having said that, it would also, in a sense, dismantle much of the New Deal, much of the growth of the administrative state over the last 90 years. And so it is, I think, worth noting, right, that this is a looming decision from the Supreme Court that points to the real limits, the real break that the conservative majority on the Supreme Court, again, appointed by presidents who did not win a popular election, confirmed by a Senate that vastly overrepresents the least populous states, the break that it poses on popular legislative efforts to accomplish extremely important goals in our society. Let me stop for a moment. The remainder of the lecture, I do want to talk about what's happening in the Ukraine, but before I do that, I should give you an opportunity to ask questions or raise comments. I'm sure, like me, many of you were dismayed by what you saw from the Senate. Anybody have a specific vignette or question or thought they want to share? Should I jump right back in?
Yes, please go ahead.
No, I can see Flossie has her hand up. Go ahead, Flossie. You have to unmute yourself. Unmask and unmute. You're still muted. Okay, got it.
Anyone who saw Ted Cruz's performance could not help but be impressed with his passion, with his dedication to washing and dragging a Black woman across the Senate floor. It was disgusting. It was insane. I think it might well cost the younger people who are becoming aware of what is happening, those youngsters, or those even into the 20s, who might have decided that they would never vote again because the Democrats were as bad as the Republicans, seeing that performance will know now where they and how they have to vote. That's my hope.
Yeah, and you know, I'm not sure whether Ted Cruz gets to steal the limelight from Lindsey Graham, Josh Hawley, Marsha Blackburn. I mean, the list of people who engage in grotesque theatrics and who, you know, were so deeply offensive. I think, and I was thinking this, I decided not to include it in the lecture, you may very well provoke a backlash. And please note that the number one predictor, at least one way of looking at American politics since Bill Clinton, is that the rate at which Black women vote is the number one predictor of who wins the presidency. When Black women turn out in large numbers, and by the way, that means like they voted 80%, they vote much higher than anybody else in the country, Democrats tend to win. And so it could be that this will backfire against the Republicans. But having said that, I do think the institutional damage that it does is lasting, even if the political advantage that Ted Cruz hopes it confers on him may be fleeting and ultimately boomerang against him. Anyone else before we move on? All right, then let me move on. And as always, feel free to interject anytime you have a question or a thought. So let's look at the Ukraine, and this is where we'll spend the rest of the lecture. And for as I said, there was a major announcement for the Russian military yesterday that it considered its goals accomplished, the goals of demilitarizing the Ukraine, preventing the oppression of the Russian minority in the Ukraine, keeping the drug-addled Nazi regime in the Ukraine from doing the damage it was doing. And as I've said, one good thing about, I suppose, a authoritarian society with tight constraints on the media is perhaps the Russian military can declare victory despite having basically been fought to a standstill and taking huge losses in the Ukraine. And I do think what we're seeing in terms of troop movements on the ground indicates that the Russian troops are moving out of the northern and some of the southern theaters and consolidating primarily in the Donbass. And there are different ways to read this, right? It could be that they are regrouping and preparing for a more organized advance that they've concluded in light of the stiff resistance they've encountered, that they cannot sustain what is essentially a 1,000-mile front, that the logistics are too hard. It's fighting too many battles at the same time and too hard to resupply their troops. So either they're pulling back and they're going to try to consolidate control over the Donbass, and I hope that the Ukrainians, Vladimir Zelensky, would accept, in a sense, as a basis for peace, greater Russian control over far eastern Ukraine, assuming it leaves the rest of the Ukraine under the control of the Ukrainian government. But it's also entirely possible that the Russians are just pulling back in order to regroup and then re-attack. And please note, even if there is some sort of negotiated settlement to this conflict, I would not consider that to be the end. I think that it's very likely, given, well, as long as Vladimir Putin remains the sole political power in Russia, very likely that Russia will invade again. So having said that, part of what you can see here, and this is a different way of representing a similar map, these are all the areas that the Ukrainians are attacking the Russian forces. And as you can see, they are attacking them across this large front, but they're being very strategic. And I'll point first to the Russian forces trying to encircle the capital, Kyiv, and in particular on the western and southern side of Kyiv, who seem to be most vulnerable in terms of the difficulty of resupplying them. And the Ukrainians are coming out of the capital, which they hold, and then ambushing, engaging, and retreating, right? And in a sense, inviting the Russians to follow them back into Kyiv, where they will be further ambushed because the Ukrainian positions are fortified, right? And so a very smart insurgency strategy with very sophisticated weaponry is taking its toll on the Russians on the ground. And again, right, we can see this in terms of the areas the Ukrainians are fighting in, and then see this in terms of the Russian response, which has been to rely increasingly on long-range aerial bombardment of civilian areas. That what this looks like in terms of a particular neighborhood in Mariupol, area that has no military targets, no military value, is the red dots are buildings that have been destroyed, yellow dots are buildings that have been damaged. this is basically a 5 square mile area. I'm sorry, I'll use my New York reference, about the size of the Upper West Side. And it is obviously being decimated, right? And to bring in just for a moment the Enlightenment, counter-Enlightenment framework for thinking about this. The Enlightenment thinkers that a month and a half ago I was introducing you to, whether we're talking about Descartes or Locke or Kant, believe that if you want to get somebody to do what you want them to do, you need to treat them as an equal human being equipped with the power to reason and address arguments to them in order to persuade them. The counter-Enlightenment view is that's not how human nature works. It's never been that way. We are not reasonable, reasoned creatures. We are sinful, willful, stubborn creatures. And for the most part, you need to set up institutions either to confuse, to use myth and mystification to instill beliefs, or you need to produce submission via will, right? And that struggles between human beings are ultimately struggles between their individual wills to power, and the person who wins is going to be the person who imposes their will on the other. If the other resists, then you have to use force, inflict pain, produce submission. And I think what we're seeing in the shift in Russian strategy into the sustained bombardment of civilian areas very much reflects that counter-Enlightenment worldview. Make the Ukrainians suffer. And please note that the people who are suffering are the people who cannot evacuate. They're the elderly, the infirm, children. And the hope is that by inflicting damage on the most vulnerable, the Ukrainians will be forced to surrender their will to fight. And I will just point out very quickly, this strategy risks provoking a reaction formation. You're trying to get me to submit, I'm going to do the opposite. And especially if you are brutal and inhumane in your treatment of me, I am going to do everything I can to get out from under your grips. And that is what we are seeing, I think, right now in the Ukraine. These are a couple images of what that strategy looks like. That's a maternity hospital, that's a school gymnasium, targets with no military value being reduced to rubble and ashes. When I say the strategy risks provoking a contrary reaction, again, this is, I think, very important, right? That the Ukrainians are mounting a substantial counteroffensive in the southeast, in the region that is closest to the Russian border, that is a stronghold for the Russians. And I think, if I've got it right, they're actually trying to cut off the Russian supply lines, which could result in a sense of loss of territory as a result of this campaign for the Russians. And the other thing that we're seeing, of course, and I'll talk about this in just a moment, Joe Biden was in Belgium, in Brussels yesterday, attended 3 summits in a single day. And just to put this in perspective, most presidents attend maybe a summit a year, right? And Joe Biden at 78 is attending 3 in a day. He must be exhausted. But on the other hand, right, these summits are producing results, which I'll start to talk with you about. One of them is the beefing up of NATO's posture in the region immediately surrounding Ukraine. And please note, again, 10 years ago, none of these countries, maybe 20 years ago, none of these countries were members of NATO. Now they're all members of NATO, and NATO is rearming, re-equipping, increasing its troop presence. Again, and I think this, if you're reading the tea leaves, because that's all we have, we don't have a window into the Kremlin to see what's happening there, it does appear that at least certain segments of the Russian military are beginning to acknowledge that this is counterproductive. It's producing the opposite of the results that it was supposed to produce, as opposed to Russia reasserting itself as a great power and claiming that its sphere of influence extends to its traditional empire or to the countries that were part of the Warsaw Pact. Now it appears that the former Warsaw Pact members are deepening their attachment to the West. The Polish government, which has been led by a populist party that in certain ways has emulated aspects of Vladimir Putin's rule, very much sees that it is probably in line for Russian aggression and is pivoting 180 degrees in an anti-Putin, pro-NATO, pro-EU posture. Things are turning in all of these respects for the region against Russia. So focusing for a moment on what happened yesterday in Brussels, there are multiple developments, all of them, I think, limited in terms of what they can do on the ground in the Ukraine. The US, the NATO countries, the European Union, unwilling to risk escalating this war by any kind of direct military intervention or even an escalation of the kinds of armaments being supplied to the Ukraine. And so in that sense, the results are limited. But in another sense, I want to say they're significant, not only in a president of the United States being invited to speak at the European Council, which is supposed to be only the leaders of the European Union, NATO's renewed focus on the East, but also on what I want to describe, using the language I've been using for several weeks, as a belated awakening to a new Cold War. And in saying this, and again, I'll return to this map for a second, Vladimir Putin looked at this map and said 20 years ago, 15 years ago, 10 years ago, that the West is already at war with Russia. And he appears to believe this, that whether it's militarily encircling Russia, intruding upon its traditional sphere of influence, or culturally corroding Eastern orthodoxy through Western values, Russia has to defend itself. And the strategy that Russia has taken has been multifaceted, including trying to increase European dependence on Russian natural resources so as to weaponize that interdependence, accruing a large foreign reserve to insulate it against sanctions, but I think also, and extremely importantly, going on a social media counteroffensive, a disinformation program that I've argued with you before was extremely important in justifying its incursions into Georgia and the Ukraine and Chechnya in the past, and also extremely important in the British vote to exit the European Union and in the American 2016 presidential elections. And yesterday at the joint European Council conference, both the United States and the European Commission announced programs to begin to counter Russian propaganda and disinformation online. And I can only hope. You will remember Joe Biden had a democracy summit in Washington, D.C. in December of 2021, in which 141 nations were invited to participate. And this was on the agenda, but it didn't become an action item. It appears finally efforts to counter disinformation coming out of Russia, coming out of China, coming out of North Korea and Iran, other autocratic regimes, taking advantage of the openness of the democratic public sphere, the porousness of that public sphere to outside influence in an age of digital interconnectivity. This $320 million that was announced yesterday, the European Union reallocating funds, this is a drop in the bucket of what is required, but at least it is finally a step in the right direction. There were also announcements about potential war crimes tribunals being set up to punish Russia for what seem to be clear violations of the law of war, both in launching a war of aggression and the way in which it has been conducted. But finally, and I think we need to underline this, at the same time at the NATO conference, steps were taken to prepare the Ukraine and the bordering regions for chemical, biological, and tactical nuclear war in the Ukraine. And as I say, it's impossible to discern the decision-making process occurring in the Kremlin right now. Are they genuinely trying to cut their losses? Are they regrouping in order to mount a new offensive? Or might they possibly escalate this warfare by bringing in new weapons? We know that Russian military strategy considers the use of chemical, biological, and tactical nuclear weapons, small battlefield nuclear weapons, to be legitimate, and that they practice using protective gear. And so the possibility that this war doesn't wind down or simply drag on as a war of attrition, which in important respects probably favors the Ukrainians, but as opposed to that potentially escalates, is also on the minds of the leaders at these summits. So let me focus just for a minute on something else that I'm thinking about and that I think is worth concluding perhaps our discussion today on. And that's asking how effective the economic warfare is against Putin. And I've arrayed at the bottom of the screen a small bookcase of books about energy and energy politics, right? From Barry Lord, who suggests in essence that culture has been shaped by the kinds of energy. The book by Andreas Malm, who introduces this wonderful, if quite jargonized distinction between endo and exosomatic energy regimes, regimes that essentially rely on the metabolism of animals, including human beings, to produce their energy. So we have horses and ox, etc., or on regimes that rely on various kinds of engines to produce their energy. Vaclav Smil, who's written this wonderful compendious history of energy and civilization. Daniel Yergin, who won a Pulitzer Prize for his book that accounts, among other things, for the emergence of the US shale oil industry. All of this is to suggest, right, that I've also suggested to you that we should be honest with ourselves, that Putin himself is an opaque actor to us. We don't know if he is being strategically rational or in fact is in the grips of some kind of mystical, religious, redemptive, ethno-nationalist ideology. But one thing that does seem clear is he has used the fact that Russia is one of the big three petrochemical producers in the world in a very strategic way, that he has timed his aggressive campaigns, including the current one, for moments when oil prices are high, when excess capacity is low, has weaponized that dependence of Europe and the world economy on Russian oil, and that we need to be thinking clearly about the way in which our reliance on burning carbon-based products to power our civilization is generating vulnerabilities. The way in which these petrostates are mainly bad actors, abuse their power, abuse their citizens, use their monopoly on this resource, which the burning of which is incredibly destructive for our environment, also to do mischief and commit atrocities in their own societies and throughout the world. So, can we effectively punish the Russian economy to a degree that allows us to generate the leverage to rein in Russian aggression? And this was one of the big announcements out of the meetings in Brussels, is that Europe would try to reduce its reliance on Russian oil by 50% in the next 2 years. And anybody who looks at that and analyzes it has to say, how in the world are you going to accomplish that? You just don't have the alternative supplies, the facilities, the infrastructure necessary to do it. It's probably an aspiration as opposed to a realistic policy goal, but it does indicate an acknowledgement that the energy dependence of Europe on Russia is emboldening a bad actor in Russia to be aggressive. So very quickly, when we look at what's being called deglobalization of the Russian economy, one of the things we see is that the Russians, and one way to put this would be if you were to walk down a major shopping thoroughfare in Moscow or St. Petersburg, it might look in many respects a lot like a major shopping thoroughfare in London or Paris or New York or San Francisco. McDonald's and Starbucks and Pizza Hut and Sony and Nike and Porsche and Ferrari, and that all, I shouldn't say all, but as you can see, a large number of their most prized foreign consumer outlets have withdrawn permanently from Russia. A large number have suspended operations, a smaller number have scaled back, and a smaller number are continuing to operate. This is especially true when we look at their largest foreign companies. Out of the 50 largest, about 20 have either withdrawn or suspended their operations. And this is being felt on the ground in Russia, and it's leading to an exodus, a brain drain from Russia. It's not merely the fact that Russia is beginning to feel a little bit more like Iran or North Korea, and that the Russians with capital and mobility and a Western sensibility are leaving. It's also the fact that people who want to talk openly about Russia being at war can be put in jail. The level of repression has gone up. And so there is a significant exodus and potentially a brain drain from Russia. And this then raises broader implications, some of them to do with the reliance of the rest of the world on Russian and Ukrainian wheat, especially in Africa and Latin America, and its potential to produce hunger. And the UN is warning about mass food shortages, and not primarily or exclusively in Europe, as Europe's breadbasket goes up in flames. I think that the really perplexing issue here, and I don't mean to be narrowly academic about this, but the question of whether or not we're beginning to see some signs of fragility in Putin's regime. And let me conclude on this theme. One of the things I emphasized to you a couple of weeks ago in talking about Putin as an anti-political thinker, and the way in which Russia has, not just under Putin's regime, but also over the course of the USSR, waged a war not only through propaganda, but also against collecting the kind of social information that enables critical, independent thinking, civil society in a public sphere, shutting down independent social science research. So you can't even figure out what's going on economically or sociologically in your own society, shutting down the free press, increasing surveillance, using informants to make people feel insecure in expressing their views, even in intimate settings. All of this makes opinion very unstable in authoritarian regimes. And one of the things we see with the velvet revolutions and the colored revolutions is regimes that seem to be so thoroughly, intimidatingly powerful, crumble very quickly. And I think this is one of the reasons why competitive authoritarianism is so threatened by proximate democratic transformation, like what was happening in the Ukraine, is that they know that their support can evaporate almost overnight. And I have no idea if there is internal concern that the damage that Putin is doing, first of all, to the impression of Russian military might, second of all, to Russia's international standing, thirdly, to the Russian economy is building up to the point where there is internal pressure against Putin from within his own regime, the possibility of a so-called palace coup in which members of his military or his inner circle will decide they have to take him out. Or if alternatively, there is growing pressure against him popularly in Russia. But I think, to be honest, that the only stable, good outcome to this conflict is one in which Vladimir Putin is no longer in charge of Russia. And I guess we have to wonder whether yesterday's announcement from the Russian military is at least some little indication that Putin's hold on power in Russia is not as secure as it was a month ago. I will stop there. And again, happy to take questions, comments. Who wants to start us out? I can't tell if anyone is speaking. If you are speaking, remember you have to hold your spacebar down or push that unmute on your microphone. So is it that there's nothing to discuss or too much to digest? I'm not used to you guys being so quiet at the end of a lecture. Anybody want to start us out?
Okay, I'll start. What on earth do you do with a tactical nuclear weapon that has any good result from the point of view of the outfit using it? It just seems to me to not be a very, very, very useful tool.
I'm sorry, was that Matt?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. I couldn't see you because I think to push your unmute, you bent out of your screen. Anyway, so there are two thoughts about this. The first is maybe you detonate it at sea, right? Or in an unpopulated area. And then that's a way of expressing your willingness to use these weapons and the necessity of the other side to surrender. The other possibility is you use it, you pull your troops back out of Kyiv and you nuke the capital, right? And in so doing, you have destroyed the government, you have destroyed the populace, you've destroyed the capacity of the military for command and control. And so, yes, this means essentially that region becomes uninhabitable for quite a while, right? But it probably produces military and governmental collapse on the part of the Ukraine. I'll just tell you very, very quickly. When I was an undergraduate, I was doing what we called at the time Soviet studies. And the professor who took a liking to me was a member of the RAND Corporation, Russian research think tank. And he brought me along to some of their meetings. And this is the kind of thing RAND used to do, simulations of battlefield nukes, right? It takes a certain kind of, I guess you might call it surgical perspective, clinical perspective. You stop thinking about the humanity of the situation, the enormity of the evil of envisioning a scenario in which a major European capital and the hundreds of thousands or millions of people that it contains are annihilated in an instant, right? Because that's what we're talking about. And you just think about the strategic implications of it. But I do think if Putin is absolutely desperate to win this war, if I'm right about his mindset as being one either steeped in the counter-enlightenment of assuming that ultimately the person with the more powerful will and the greater power to impose their will wins, or that he's got some sort of mad, redemptive, religious perspective, that's the kind of thinking that leads one to countenance this, even if it is so barbarous that it's hard to contemplate. But does that help to think this through a little bit, Matt? And I can see another political scientist wants in. Matt, do you have anything more you want to say?
Well, yeah, I'm wondering whether there aren't other more rational Russians who would say that's just not a good idea and I'm not going to do it.
Yeah, no, I think you may have heard me say before that I would hope that if Putin ordered a nuclear strike, the Russian military has a cell or a hole in the ground for him. But I don't know. I mean, one of the things that one of the people I've been reading suggests is that the effect of the sanctions has been to tighten Putin's control over his regime, not to loosen it, because the oligarchs who depend upon him are, in a sense, now fighting for their shares of a shrunken pie, and they recognize that only Putin can distribute them. So I'm not sure, but I certainly hope you're right, that in a sense, this would be a bridge too far, even for the Russian military. But please remember that Putin has basically transformed every major institution in the Russian state by populating it with loyalists. And so he has a very tight grip of power, grip on power in Russia. John, you wanted to respond too. Go ahead.
Not really. I just wanted to note that with an unfortunate slip of the tongue, you left the RAND Corporation as a Russian research think tank. It's actually an Air Force research think tank, and no one should be misunderstand.
Yeah, I think what I was trying to say is that there was a Russian study group or a Russian military strategy group within RAND. But yes, of course, RAND is American. Originally Air Force, it's now independent, right?
I don't know.
I think so. And
long time since I followed that stuff. So
yeah, long time for me as well. The professor I had at Occidental College, who was the former Russia CIA desk chair. My funny memory of attending RAND is him talking about how many MiG backfire bombers were stationed at a certain place, and the other people around the table saying, well, that's probably classified information, but if you want to share that with us, that's fine. So yes, and it's a very peculiar world. I think RAND may be different today than it was during the Cold War, but it was a world in which, with clinical detachment, people talked about different scenarios for using battlefield tactical nuclear weapons and how that would influence strategy on the ground. And so both the Russian and the American military engage in this kind of thinking. From a less clinical perspective, it's something you don't even want to fathom. But nevertheless, I think when your adversary has these weapons, when their strategy includes using these weapons, you can't ignore the possibility. Yeah, the chilling note on which to conclude. I'm sorry, Bob, you go ahead. Take us someplace else.
Well, I'm not sure it's very far from where we've been, but you used the term tactical military nuclear weapons. And my understanding of that always has been that they're relatively small. And then and yet you say this weapon can wipe out Kyiv entirely, destroy the whole place, essentially kill the entire population. Is that the size of a tactical nuclear weapon?
I may be in over my head at this point. So my understanding is that there's a new generation of smaller tactical nuclear weapons. My understanding of Kyiv is that, you know, the inner city is not more than 10 square miles. So how small is the blast zone of a small tactical nuclear weapon? That's something I can research and get back to you on next week. I don't have the answer off the top of my head, but even if it's much smaller than the large nuclear weapons that we used in World War II and that came to be completely dwarfed by the nuclear weapons we developed in the Cold War, my sense is that it may spread radiation poisoning over an area the size of Kyiv. That was the assumption I was operating on, but I'm not sure.
Okay, I don't know what to say. I don't want to hope you're right. I don't want to hope you're wrong. Whatever. I just hope it's not used.
Exactly, and the way that Matt suggested that sanity would prevail somewhere within the Russian military leadership, even if its head is insane. All right, everybody, we went to a grim place here at the end. Let me just conclude by saying, you know, that there is, and I want to just focus on this for a moment. To my mind, and the fact that there was the bombing in Western Ukraine today is what really unsettles my thinking about this. I thought yesterday that the Russian military was, in a sense, creating an off-ramp for itself by declaring that they had accomplished their mission and that they were now going to concentrate on the Donbass. Let us hope that that is the case, and that in a sense, they may be potentially winding down their operations instead of escalating them in the awful ways that we've been contemplating for the last few minutes. All right, so you guys take care, be well, and we'll get back together again next week. Thank you, and see you soon. Bye.